I'm Manawoltos, and today I've got something a bit special. I was looking at the time today that I started recording, and I thought, I didn't really have enough time to really record some gameplay and to do any heavy editing or anything like that, so I decided to do something else instead, and open up one of my spreadsheets. And here we have it, my attempt to do some power scaling in regarding to some Star Trek spaceships. Now, I don't have any numerical power scale, so it's not really a scale, but it's more of a power order. So I'm looking at, and I'm trying to decide which one's the more powerful of the ones here. So, of course, here we have the Sovereign class. Okay, so in order to explain what I've got here, I've got a number of different spaceships from Star Trek, and I have organized from top to bottom with more powerful on the top, less powerful on the bottom, and I've got separate columns for separate power scaling. And by that I mean that sometimes things don't really scale well against each other, so it's best to maybe just, well, to not scale them. That's because I don't have all the numbers, and so this is just something I managed to put together at a whim. So the most obvious scaling is, of course, going from the main line, famous in Star Trek. By the way, I'm doing this pre-Kelvin timeline, so this is all pre-2009 canon. So we've got the NX class, famously the Enterprise in the series Enterprise. I haven't put the one with the secondary hull on here because I don't know too much about it. Now we've got the Constitution class, which is what you see being used in the original series, the Constitution class refit, which is significantly different from the Constitution class, and we see that one being used in the early Star Trek movies, being introduced in, I believe, the motion picture itself. So then we have the Excelsior class, which is, so the Constitution class, let me just go back a step here. Don't want to get too far ahead of myself. That's where you've got the NCC 1701 and the Constitution class refit. The NCC 1701 Enterprise is refit to the Enterprise A. Well, no, it's not refit to the Enterprise A. I don't want to get my canon mixed up. It's refit to a Constitution class refit, and then it's destroyed, and then it's replaced by the Enterprise A, which is also of the same type as the Constitution class refit. Then we've got the USS Enterprise NCC 1701-B. Is there a hyphen? I think there's a hyphen. The Excelsior class, and also the Excelsior itself. We're going to talk about the refit later. Then we've got the Ambassador class, which is Enterprise C, and the Galaxy class, which is the Enterprise D. We're going to skip over the Intrepid for now and go to the Sovereign class, Enterprise E. Now, the reason I am scaling them like this is it's generally pretty obvious that they should be scaled this way. Not only the most obvious reason, of course, is author intent, that they're intended to be more technologically advanced and more powerful as time goes on, but also an important thing to realize is that generally they are getting larger to some extent. Of course, the Sovereign is smaller than the Galaxy class, but when the Sovereign comes out, it has a lot more advanced technology than when the Galaxy class comes out. Same thing with the Galaxy and the Ambassador and the Excelsior. And the Excelsior class is significantly larger than the Constitution class refit. In fact, if we switch over to this image here, I've got a website open, Ex Astris Scientia, or Scientia if you want to go Latin classical pronunciation. So you can find this at the website that appears there. This Federation fleet chart was made in March 2016, but it shows you a lot of the canon Starfleet ships, and I don't think it shows us any non-canon ones, or as far as I know, but you can generally see what I'm talking about here. So at the top left here, we've got the Constitution class, and there's some size measurement, 289 meters. The Constitution 2, or the Constitution refit, as some like to call it, for your 5 meters. The reason I didn't put the Miranda class in the power scaling is because I need to do a bit more research on how it scales, because although the Constitution class usually appears to be larger, here we actually see that the size difference isn't actually too much. For example, at the rear of the saucer section, we have this this expanded bit here, and of course we've got the roll bar. So I don't know exactly what that means, and we don't see any Miranda classes in the original series, not in canon anyway. So that could indicate that it is a later design, which does not necessarily mean if it's more powerful than the Constitution refit, depending on when exactly they were designed, or what exactly was put into their design, but they seem to be relatively well matched, or at least the Miranda class was able to stand up to the Constitution class in battle in, of course, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Now, of course, following the Constitution, we have the significantly larger Excelsior over here, 469 meters to the 305 meters of a Constitution refit. And I do trust this fleet chart. They do a lot. The person that does this does a lot of research on this, so I find it to be relatively reliable. Now, I generally people may point out that there's differences between the Excelsior that we see in, I think it's the Search for Spock, and the Excelsior that we see in Generations, which is the Enterprise B. And of course, the differences, they are real differences, but of course, outside of off screen, the difference is that they wanted to destroy a bit of it, and they didn't actually want to damage the model, and so they added bits onto it. Of course, in canon, there isn't really much of an explanation for that, so when I'm talking about the Excelsior refit, I'm talking about the DS9 era refit, specifically the USS Lakota that went up against the Defiant. So it is very different from the Enterprise B. But nevertheless, the Excelsior is much larger than the Constitution class, and when it came out, presumably had a number of improvements. Of course, there was the failed transwarp experiment, but that's another story. We can go into that at another time. I'm really laying out a lot of Star Trek knowledge here. Of course, I can bet that if this video becomes widespread, that there will be dozens of comments proving me wrong. And you know what? I appreciate that. I really do. I like to be correct, and that means that if my original facts are not correct, or rather, not facts, then I would rather be corrected than to stand in falsehood. Anyway, so from the Excelsior, we've got, where is it? That's the Niagara. I'm looking for the Ambassador, which is larger, as we can see here. Clearly is significantly larger, and we see the design lineage. It looks a lot more like the later Galaxy class, and it presumably is more powerful if we accept offers, intentions, and it being larger and doing a number of different things. Now, of course, larger doesn't always mean more powerful in Star Trek, as we are about to discuss later on. So from the Ambassador, we've got the Galaxy class, and the Galaxy class, 643 meters, so it's more than twice the length of the Constitution refit. Now, of course, it's important to note that length doesn't mean everything, as we are about to discover later on in this video. But that's the general lineage. Now, of course, then we've got the Sovereign class, and the Sovereign class is a bit longer, but it has less volume overall, and there's some technological improvements over the Galaxy class that I'm not going to talk about right now. I'm going to save that for a little bit later, but for now, let's get back to the spreadsheet. Okay, so the Intrepid class. Why do I scale the Intrepid class between the Sovereign class and the Galaxy class? How could the Intrepid class be more powerful than the Galaxy class? Well, as soon as I got off, I'm going right back to this chart. Here we see the Intrepid class, only 344 meters. It's almost half the length of a Galaxy class, and it's a lot different in height as well, and width if you were to see it from a different viewpoint, but we're just looking at the profile here. There are significant differences, and in order to scale these consistently, I'm thinking of generally, not always, but generally going with when they were officially, or not officially, but when they first were being used, or when the ships were first commissioned. I forget what it's called, but when they go out on their first missions, we see the Galaxy class is slower than the Intrepid class when the Intrepid class first comes out, and speed is very important in combat, and also has inferior weapons to the Intrepid class. For example, I don't think that in the early seasons of the Next Generation they had quantum torpedoes, and I think the Intrepid class has some. I know they definitely have Tri-Cobalt warheads. However, it's important to note that I don't think those are standard equipment for Intrepid class starships to carry. But generally, the Sovereign class and the Intrepid class, we do see some design similarities, and that may just be a coincidence. However, it is important to note that I believe from what I read, they came out at a similar time period, so it is probable that they have a similar technological sophistication with the bioneural gel packs, which are supposedly an improvement over whatever the Galaxy class has, and a whole host of other differences, like more powerful holodecks and a bunch of different things that are supposedly better than the Galaxy class. Or at least when the Galaxy class first came out. Because, of course, another thing to note in Star Trek is that these spaceships are probably constantly being upgraded as technology comes out, and so the Galaxy class, for example, in I think it was Tapestry, we see what people call the Galaxy X class or the Galaxy Dreadnought. It's a Galaxy class that has free nacelles. It's got those special phaser shooters that are on stalks coming off of the saucer section, and it has this big I forget exactly what it's called, but it fires a beam that's underneath the saucer section and unfortunately covers up the captain's yacht, which is still visible. In other words, it wasn't the best best way to design it for that episode, and I heard one of the original designers of a Galaxy class for the show really cringe over it. But and that thing shot through what are later called the Negvar class spaceships with ease, and so things can be upgraded. But if we're going for production model, Intrepid class is probably a lot more powerful than Galaxy class when it first comes out. And of course, that is debatable. I'm not saying that it's, when I say a lot more powerful, that's probably an overstatement. It's probably just a little bit more powerful is a more accurate statement, like we're going to see later. Now, another thing to note, another reason why I put the Sovereign above the Intrepid is if we look back at the other, to the spreadsheet, we can see on column M, we see a power scale relating to the Borg. We're going to talk about them a little bit later, but generally speaking, actually let's look at column J first. General power scale for the Borg. We've got the Borg probes at the bottom. They're really weak. They are capable of being destroyed from the inside with one, I think it's a photon torpedo. However, it is important to note that when the Intrepid class USS Voyager went up against the Borg probe, they didn't intend to destroy it. So that fight cannot be accurately power scaled because we don't have any reason to believe that the Intrepid went all out or that the Borg probe went all out, because oftentimes the Borg don't want to destroy what they're attacking. And that's why I didn't put the Borg probe in column M when comparing the Borg ships to Starfleet ships, but instead decided to keep it in column J, along with the other Borg ships for their own power scale. So the Borg sphere is, as we see in Insurrection, it's smaller than the Borg cube, and in at least one episode of Voyager, when they have the futuristic drone that was created from modified nanites that attached to the mobile holographic emitter, it's a very convoluted thing that doesn't even make a lot of sense if you really think about it, but essentially the Borg sphere in that episode was considered to be a serious threat to the Intrepid class Voyager. Now, of course, it's important to note that I'm not saying that this is an absolute scale, an absolute power scale, because the Voyager is a heavily modified Intrepid class. Over the years, it's been modified in many different ways. In addition to that, it probably carries a lot of non-standard equipment, so we don't know what a regular Intrepid class that doesn't miss its space dock appointments in Starfleet space and does all those things would do when faced with a Borg sphere. But we do know what happens when a Sovereign class faces a Borg sphere. Now, in the movie Star Trek First Contact, hopefully I didn't say Insurrection earlier, somebody's going to be triggered if I did, we see the Sovereign class and the Enterprise E, and the Defiant, which is a Defiant class, which relates to power scale column P over here. We see the Sovereign class and the Defiant class and several other Starfleet ships go up against the Borg cube, and they eventually defeat the Borg cube at the Battle of Sector 001 by focusing firepower on one spot, and therefore, instead of having to worry about the frequency of the phasers and the Borg being able to block that, they just attack with a higher magnitude, or amplitude, which of course, if your shields your shields can only put so much energy into it. So if you attack at one spot with enough, they won't be able to do too much about that. And that's how they defeated the Borg Cube. But it is notable that the Sovereign class probably would not have been able to pull that off on its own. Same thing with the Defiant class, which was heavily damaged in that fight. And a number of other classes that I'm not listing on this power scale as well. So essentially, and we've seen the Borg Cube go up against the Galaxy class more than once, and essentially, if we follow the power scaling from column M to column A, it means that none of the canon Starfleet ships, besides, of course, Endgame Voyager, but none of the canon ship classes in any of their standard equipments would be able to beat a Borg Cube one-on-one using without using asymmetrical warfare of some sort, such as beaming it full of torpedoes or doing something really weird. I don't know, but it definitely would be dangerous. So the Borg Cube goes above the Sovereign class. Now, why is the Sovereign class above the Borg Sphere? The reason for that is because in, again, Star Trek First Contact, I rewatched the scene with it just to make sure I got this right. A Borg sphere emerges from the Borg Cube and essentially, as far as I can tell, is undamaged and is not receiving any damage until then time warps back into the past and starts bombarding Earth. And then the USS Enterprise E, which is a Sovereign class, follows it back in time, and then attacks what is seemingly an undamaged Borg sphere with the Borg Queen on board of it, and destroys it with 4 quantum torpedoes. So this clearly puts the Sovereign class above the Borg sphere. Now, someone might say, well, what about the Intrepid class? Wouldn't they be able to do the same thing? I don't know. In universe, we don't see anything that indicates that the Intrepid class is a serious threat to a Borg sphere, except for Endgame Voyager destroying the Borg sphere that pulls the Voyager in that episode. But of course, Endgame Voyager, for power scaling purposes, should not be considered a regular Intrepid class. Just like over here on column M, the Intrepid class being put below the Borg sphere is with the caveat that it may be different if we're talking about a regular, well-maintained Intrepid class. It could also go the other way, depending on whether you think Voyager has become more powerful or less powerful in its encounters in the Delta Quadrant. Okay. I'm not going to show any Borg images at the moment. But anyway, the Borg Tactical Cube, due to its purpose, is probably superior in combat capability to the Borg Cube. Now, it is to be noted that the actual scaling of the Borg Tactical Cube comes into question when in an episode it's shown next to the Intrepid class, and it's actually pretty small if you look at it. I'm going to see if I can... actually, no, I'm not going to. Or maybe I am. I was thinking about perhaps finding some scale on it. Because if it is indeed smaller, then that could mean a difference. However, on Memory Beta, which you shouldn't really use if you're looking for too much canon stuff, because it's non-canon, it's telling me the same dimensions as the regular Borg Cube. But I'm wondering what it says on Exastris. So I'm going to take a look if there's anything on there about that. Probably not. I'm looking off screen. You know what? You should be able to look at something more interesting while I'm doing this. So I'm just going to switch over to other image. There we go. Okay. So let me just quickly look it up. I'm probably not going to bring it on screen. Memory beta. Okay. I'm not getting any good links, so I'm going to have to type it in the URL. I was trying to get a link for Memory Alpha, which is a wiki. So let me see fleet charts, and let's see alien fleet charts, huge vessels. See a Borg cube on a fleet chart. Gamma quadrant and delta quadrant vessels. Yeah, Exestrus hasn't done a chart on the Borg cube, but if we are to assume that the tactical cube is the same size as a regular cube, let me just switch back to spreadsheet. Then that means that the tactical cube is definitely superior to the Borg cube, simply because it has armor, which is the only noticeable difference. As far as I can tell, but that alone makes it just that one tiny bit superior. Okay, so now for the Defiant class and Nebula class scaling. Okay, of course Borg cube is more powerful than Defiant class. However, Defiant class is more powerful than the Nebula class. Now you might be wondering here, what are you doing? What is wrong with you? You put the Nebula class above the Galaxy class? That's wrong. That's just wrong. That is heresy. You are a heretic for putting the Nebula class above the Galaxy class. And why am I putting the Defiant class above the Galaxy class? Well, the Defiant class has ablative hull plating, and it uses quantum torpedoes, and it's got pulse phasers. It's generally designed to actually fight the Borg, which is something that notably the Galaxy class failed in doing. And its design actually began after the Battle of Wolf 359, and at that time the Nebula class and the Galaxy class were already in existence, so they decided to build a dedicated warship to be able to engage the Borg in some capacity. So the Defiant class, of course, when it first comes out, is actually technically a failed design, but they eventually fix it. So the reason, well, they don't fix it fully, but they manage to compensate for the problems in the Defiant class. For example, when the Defiant class first comes out, it is stated that the ship could potentially tear itself apart because of all the different things that the ship is doing. It's overpowered for such a small vessel. And to show you exactly what I'm talking about here, let me just show you the chart. And here we see at the bottom center, there's the Defiant here, compared to the Galaxy class and the Nebula class right next to each other here. So I think that since it's a dedicated warship, it has superior weapons to the original Galaxy class, and we can't include cloaking because that's not standard equipment for the Defiant class. It's important to remember that that was a special treaty thing for that one spaceship and is not standard equipment. But when comparing so because of that, I think that it's generally more powerful than the Galaxy class and the Nebula class. Now, if you want to actually get into some practical power scaling for things that happened on screen besides dialogue, we see a Galaxy class being overwhelmed by, I think it's 3 or 4 Jem'Hadar attack ships. Meanwhile, the Defiant class is similarly overwhelmed. However, it definitely fares a lot better than the Galaxy class. And later on, with more experience fighting against the Jem'Hadar, the Defiant class is definitely a lot more powerful, and we see that it's very versatile and very useful. So I have to say that the Defiant class is definitely above the Galaxy class in combat ability, because the Galaxy class is a semi-civilian starship. It's got all the Starfleet stuff, but it also has all these civilians, which doesn't make it less powerful. Let's just emphasize that. It doesn't actually make it less powerful. It just is not a purpose-built warship like the Defiant. And of course the Defiant has a ablative plating, which the Galaxy class and the Nebula class don't have, at least not when they originally come out. So anyway, Galaxy and Nebula. Why am I putting the Nebula above the Galaxy class? And there's a couple reasons for this. Now, as for direct power scaling from feats, we don't actually have many Nebula class feats to compare with the Galaxy class. The only feat that we really have on the Nebula class is probably being able to destroy an unspecified type of Cardassian ship that the Cardassians employed in protecting their borders, and the Nebula class apparently destroyed those relatively quickly. So that's important to note. In addition, contrary to popular belief, the Nebula class is not a kit bash, or at least the eventual model that was used is not a kit bash. It was molded from a specially designed thing for the Nebula class. It is its own spaceship and is not a kit bash. It's not pieces from the Galaxy class just put in a different configuration. Although in universe, that is sort of what it is, in that it uses Galaxy parts in a different configuration. But generally speaking, the big controversy about the Nebula class, when you're trying to debate Nebula versus Galaxy, is the size. Now, of course, the Nebula class is shorter, but its configuration is different. So that's not necessarily a winning point here. As of course we can see, smaller ships like the Defiant and the Intrepid class can be significantly powerful as well. But what we do have to note here is the scaling of the Nebula class, the physical size of it. And many people say that it was originally intended to be smaller than the Galaxy class. However, if we actually look at the model, we see that the bridge module on the Nebula class and the bridge module on the Galaxy class, as this Ex Astra Scientia pointed out, are actually very similar in size relative to the saucer section. And we can see the same thing with the windows as well. And we know, if you want to talk about Offer's intention and all that, we can talk about Gene Roddenberry's intention for the bridge module to be used for scaling, size scaling, a scale reference. And if that's how we're supposed to use it, then, and the windows as well, then we have to say that the saucer section is comparable to that of the Galaxy class. Now, it is notable that the secondary hull, well, the engineering hull, I don't know if we can really call it a secondary hull at this point, since it doesn't have a neck, like many of the other starships have, is a little bit smaller. But it does also have this pod that comes up. And the pod is modular. Now, as to the kinds of modules that you can put in there, there's not too much canon information on that. So, however, it is implied that it is a modular type of thing, which means it gives it some versatility. And someone else has also argued that because of its actual smaller dimensions, the Nebula class, if it's using the same power plant and the same type of shield projectors as the Galaxy class, actually has a better shield geometry. Now, of course, that is a very debatable point, because you might say, well, since it's smaller, they might not use as many shield projectors or whatever you want to use for shielding. I don't know if we actually have that much canon information on that as well, as to how exactly the shields work. But I would be interested if someone were to tell me, though. But I have to say that because of its modular nature and similar internal volume to the Galaxy class, it definitely is a comparable starship, and because of its versatility, I'd have to give it a slight up over the Galaxy class. And by slight, I mean it's extremely slight. It is very slight. Well, I had to take a break there. This is actually going on for a lot longer than I imagined it would, but just to explain the power scaling. So, overall, let's switch back to the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is going to be expanded very much in the future, simply because of the sheer scale of things that we have. The next thing is the Defiant class against the Excelsior class refit, specifically referring to the Lakota class, not Lakota class, but the Lakota, which is an Excelsior class that has been refit in the DS9 era, and is expected by the people that sent it out on a mission to potentially defeat the Defiant. In other words, their expectations of its combat ability are pretty high. In addition to that, we actually see in the episode the fight between the Defiant class and the Excelsior class refit. The actual Defiant and the Lakota is a longer, protracted fight that is very difficult. And then you consider that the crew of the Lakota were actually intending to destroy the Defiant, while the Defiant was only trying to disable the Lakota, and you count that into the power scaling as well, and then you can also count in the end result, that the Defiant came out on top, with the Lakota definitely being heavily damaged. We can say that for sure the Defiant class is probably superior to the Excelsior class refit Lakota variant, of course. Now, of course, another thing that some people might say here is, well, the crew of the Defiant are very skilled, and of course, we have to also realize that the crew of the Lakota are also experienced Starfleet officers and are also probably very skilled. We just don't have any knowledge of how skilled they are, so we can't really compare that. But what we can say is that for the Lakota to be able to go toe-to-toe with the Defiant in a relatively long fight for Star Trek, it would definitely have to be better than an Ambassador class. And of course is obviously better than an Excelsior class. So anyway, that concludes my brief discussion on some Star Trek power scaling. Just a couple of notes here. We can't really compare the Sovereign class to the Defiant class, and the Intrepid class to the Defiant class, because we really haven't seen them in similar situations or going directly against each other, and that's why I'm not putting them in the same power scale. Now, of course, we can do more calculations on the armaments and the destructive capabilities and all sorts of different things, and eventually perhaps arrive on a conclusion, but that is not the scope of this. This is just something that I came up with real quick, opened up a spreadsheet, and wrote down a few things. I don't even think spreadsheets are supposed to be used this way, but I just wanted a neat way to organize my information. So on that note, thank you all for watching. Please tell me what you think in the comments below, and I will be seeing you all next time, probably with some gameplay tomorrow. And I will toss over and out.